This podcast series is full of difficult and troubling content from the start. It includes strong language, deals with themes of child loss and sickness, and could be triggering. Please take care while listening. Lucy Letby lost her second appeal a few days ago. We're recording this in early November 2024, and she has already been convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill 7 more at the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital. Damned by juries twice, damned by the appeal court twice, damned by a new book by BBC Panorama journalists John Coffey and Judith Maritz, damned by great chunks of the British media, damned by many of the doctors who worked with her. Lucy Letby is a monster, and that's official.
Lady Justice Thirlwell, the judge in charge of the public inquiry into what went wrong, has condemned people who dare to question whether Lucy Letby got a fair trial.
There has been a huge outpouring of comment from a variety of quarters on the validity of the convictions. So far as I'm aware, it has come entirely from people who were not at the trial. All of this noise has caused enormous additional distress to the parents who have already suffered far too much.
We too feel desperately sorry for the parents who lost babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
But sometimes the law gets it wrong. I know, because in 2001 I made a radio documentary for the BBC questioning the statistic that said that the chances of Sally Clark of killing her 2 babies were 73 million to 1. That turned out to be rubbish. Sally was freed, but the torture of being jailed on wrong evidence broke her. And this victim of a monstrous miscarriage of justice died long before her time. Fear of history repeating itself is what's driving me to make this podcast. And I am not alone in worrying that Lucy Letby might be Sally Clark 2.0.
So I'm Jane Hutton. I'm a professor of statistics in the University of Warwick. The Warwick Statistics Department is one of the most highly ranked in the world. I've had about 40 years experience of statistics and statistics applied to medicine as well as to other areas.
So the question with Sally Clark was not who murdered these babies, but was there a crime?
Yes.
Do you think the Sally Clark case and the Lucy Letby case, obviously they're a big difference, are fundamentally the same in this regard?
They're fundamentally the same, and the Court of Appeal judgment makes the same mistakes. One problem was that that number was not a sensible statistic in itself, but it's also the wrong number. It's the wrong question. What we know is 2 babies have died. What we then need to ask is, what are the possible causes of death?
In the Sally Clark case, Professor Sir Roy Meadow told the court that the chances of her having one cot death was 8,500 to 1, so that the chances of having 2 were 8,500 times 8,500, which is 73 million to 1. But if they were brothers, and they were, you can't multiply the odds like that. And the same goes for Lucy Letby.
One big issue, which is the same as Sally Clark, there were twins and triplets. And in fact, prosecution and the Court of Appeal rely on saying it's a surprising coincidence that twins and triplets were ill at the same time. It's not a surprising coincidence.
Cheshire Police hired Professor Hutton to advise them on the proper way of looking at statistics in their inquiry. And then, without ever telling the defence, they fired her. So the jury never got to hear about her grave concerns about the case. They didn't, but you can. You're listening to Was There Ever a Crime? The Trials of Lucy Letby, Episode 3, Enter Sherlock Holmes. Not. Written and presented by me, John Sweeney.
And me, Edward Abel-Smith.
The greatest detective in British history, Sherlock Holmes, was made up, a work of fiction, a story written down to entertain people. Here's the real thing.
I'm Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes, Senior Investigating Officer with Operation Hummingbird.
Operation Hummingbird is what Cheshire Police called their inquiry into the spike of deaths at the neonatal unit in the Countess of Chester Hospital, and led to the convictions against Lucy Letby. When she was convicted of 7 counts of murder, the Cheshire cops put out a PR video showing off how they did it. Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes is the star.
When we got this, it's not a secret because it's been in the media and everything that Lucy Letby had been moved off the ward. The deaths and collapses had stopped.
That's not true. Babies treated in the unit died long after Lucy Letby left. Before the trial, Professor Jane Hutton was hired by Cheshire Constabulary to advise them on the proper way of understanding statistics. The full picture was not of a wonderful unit broken by a serial killer. Far from it.
And then we had a decision made that with the lack of staffing, lack of equipment, the unit would be downgraded, would not be able to take in babies that were seriously ill. So the unit was downgraded, and at the same time, Letby was moved on to other duties. So you cannot draw any conclusions about, the false implication that the deaths rate went down because Letby wasn't there is simply the alternative explanation is the deaths went down because there was a recognition that the unit was not capable of operating at level 2.
Level 2 means that the neonatal unit was capable of looking after very premature babies. For Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes to assign sole cause of death in the decline in deaths to the removal of Lucy Letby, and not bother to mention the alternative, innocent explanation that the unit stopped taking in very sick babies, is what statisticians call confirmation bias. And that's not good. The Detective Superintendent continues.
The immediate question for me, once I'd said, yeah, we'll investigate that, was, well, why don't you go and arrest her right now? Which was a good question, quite difficult not to answer. But ultimately, we've seen many times in investigations like this where we've gone the wrong way. Police nationally have gone the wrong way, jumped into a suspect. Now, my view of that was by investigating that it could be anyone means we're not focused on one person. So investigating that it could be anything means we're not focused on any one event, which means that when you come later on and the defence want to attack your investigation for being, you chose it was Lucy Letby, you chose it was this event. No, we didn't choose that, and we didn't choose that. Actually, I had a choice. I'd have wanted the experts to come back and said, we found it. It was a bad bug in the water and that happened. I can tell parents that it was tragic, but this is not murder.
A bad bug in the water. Killer bacteria from the sewage leaks. Well, that's what we suspect caused the spike in deaths. That and a poorly run unit, taking in very sick premature babies, with senior nurses got rid of and consultants doing 2 scheduled ward rounds a week rather than 2 a day. That's our hypothesis for the cause of the spike. It's funny peculiar that the detective superintendent mentions a bad bug in the water, but then in the video says nothing more about the neonatal unit being, effectively, an infection factory. What's kind of bleakly funny is that the Cheshire Police PR video on how they convicted Lucy Letby is a nigh-on perfect exhibit of confirmation bias. Not Sherlock Holmes goes on.
The arrest was planned for the purpose of obtaining evidence by questioning. Obviously, our evidence and our statistical analysis showed that Lucy Letby was present at everything. So there is, in effect, she's a suspect, but she's also the key source of information. She knows more about this case than anyone else.
Stop right there. Replay that.
Our evidence and our statistical analysis showed that Lucy Letby was present at everything.
Lucy Letby being present at everything suspicious? That is, says the lead copper. That could be, some say, confirmation of confirmation bias. Detective Superintendent Hughes goes on.
What we found out was, in neonatal infants, it's very clear that they know when a baby's going to collapse and die, and parents are already prepared for that. and that neonatal units, which my expectation was that it's full of sick babies that could die at any moment. It's actually not. So they explained that these babies do not die. So if a baby collapses, it's usually expected. And even on the outside chance of it being unexpected, it's always explainable. What separated this collection of events away from everything else was that they were unexpected and unexplained.
Actually, coroners found that 6 out of the 7 babies that Letby is accused of killing died because of natural causes. The 7th baby did not have an inquest. But what about the detective superintendent's notion that if a baby collapses, it's usually expected? John asked Professor Jane Hutton.
What did Cheshire Police, when they came, they knocked on your door, what happened and what did you do?
Basically, I told them what the correct methods of doing such an analysis were. Obviously, I was aware of the Royal Statistical Society, healthcare serial killers. The essence of that, I told them the standard methods by which you would correctly investigate this.
Which is what? What are those?
You start with a very clear definition of what you mean by an unexpected collapse or death. So that premature infants in neonatal intensive care are not stable and they're not healthy, contrary to what the prosecution seems to have alleged. You're not in intensive care if you're well. You're pretty ill. So, and they're very variable. And so you have to say, when you say unexpected collapse, unexpected by whom?
On the Cheshire Police video, you see the duty roster table of X's showing Lucy Letby on duty at all events with which she was charged.
So at that point, I knew that in most cases, we'd been able to prove already that Lucy Letby was present. There was more work to be done, and I could prove that it was inflicted harm.
Is that how Professor Jane Hutton would have gone about it? So what the jury was presented with in the prosecution case was the roster. And so in simple terms, these are suspicious events. So for example, 7 babies die suspiciously, and the common denominator is Lucy Letby is on duty all 7 times, therefore she must have killed the babies, therefore she must be a serial killer. Correct?
That is completely wrong, of course, because what you don't have is your definition of expected or unexpected death.
So what is wrong with this duty roster which says, hey, there she is, all these babies are dying, she's the serial killer? What's wrong with that?
You're not considering alternative explanations.
Considering alternative explanations is the law of the land. Since Anglo-Saxon times, if someone is charged with an offence, they have a right to a fair trial by jury. Over centuries, that principle has been buttressed by a thicket of laws. It is the law that the police have a duty in murder cases to pursue every line of inquiry. In plain English, to consider alternative explanations.
In episode 1 of this podcast, A Hospital Full of Shit, we set out an alternative explanation that killer bacteria from raw sewage in the neonatal unit could explain the spike in deaths, that it was an infection factory, and that at least the first 3 babies Lucy Letby was accused of killing had sepsis. In episode 2, The Deluded, we set out the evidence, including from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, that the consultants who pointed the finger at Lucy Letby were doing 2 scheduled ward rounds a week instead of 2 a day. Professor Hutton sets out why looking for alternative explanations matters.
I mean, one of the babies that Letby allegedly killed, if I remember correctly, hadn't been seen by a consultant by the 3rd day of life. 3rd day of life of a very prevalent consultant hasn't yet been. And of course, Letby had never been on duty at the time of the alleged attack.
This is baby C, who died in June 2015, who, like 4 babies in the unit that month, had sepsis. Sepsis, we believe, was caused by killer bacteria from the raw sewage in the neonatal units. A key alternative explanation that was never properly investigated, or investigated at all. Once again, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health criticised the consultants when they found out that they were doing insufficient ward rounds. On the specific issue of the consultants not putting the hours in, Professor Hutton continues.
That's the kind of information that should have been coming out in a properly designed thing, and that rota should be making it very clear what the alternative explanations are and how you can eliminate them. When you say this is the only explanation, the answer is no, it isn't. You need to know what explanations have been considered, what is the evidence for and against each of those explanations.
So, rather than jumping to the conclusion that Lucy Letby did it, Professor Hutton would have tested the assumption whether an it was done. She would have painted in the background a neonatal unit that was taking in too many very sick babies, a unit with a chronic sewage problem, killer bacteria, and overworked staff, a unit with not enough senior nurses, and consultants who are often missing in action. By the way, this isn't rocket science. This is common sense. When someone accuses someone else of doing something wrong, it's right and proper to look at the accusation and the accuser and the defendants and the facts in the round before coming to a judgment. And that is something Professor Hutton fears the police did not do. And then there is the echo from the Sally Clark case. Although it wasn't, but that's that duty roster
Is a nightmare.
Is a nightmare. Why is it a nightmare, Jane? Explain to me, why is it a nightmare?
So one big issue, which is the same as Sally Clark, is it's presented without recognition of, I think 6 babies are repeated in the lines to try to create an impression. Operation Hummingbird said this, they need a good visual. So you're trying to create an impression of a lot of events. And then the other thing that was not clearly marked was the fact they were twins and triplets. And in fact, prosecution and the Court of Appeal rely on saying it's a surprising coincidence that twins and triplets were ill at the same time. It's not a surprising coincidence.
Why? Explain why it's not a surprising coincidence.
It's not surprising because in the case of the triplets, they were what is called monochorionic. That means they had one placenta. Anybody can go to the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, look up the guidelines for monochorionic pregnancies. They are very high risk, even twins, before they're even born. You know they're high risk. High risk means they're much more likely to be ill or to die. They were born prem, they were very low birth weight. Those, again, are very high risks. Twin pregnancies, triplet pregnancies are very likely to have cerebral palsy, an area I've worked in. So it is very far from surprising that they would be ill at the same time.
When the triplets were born, the assumption of the police and the prosecution was that they were healthy. That was the story the jury was told. That was also assumed by BBC Panorama journalists John Coffey and Judith Moritz in their book Unmasking Lucy Letby, The Untold Story of the Killer Nurse.
By the way, folks, John Coffey is a friend of mine. He worked heroically on our second BBC Panorama film about the Church of Scientology, and also heroically produced our 2018 BBC Panorama Taking on Putin, about the killer in the Kremlin's war against my friend Alexei Navalny. John Coffey is a hero to me, who I fear is dead wrong about Lucy Letby. There are a lot of them about. Unmasking Lucy Letby was reviewed in the Times by Janice Turner, herself an excellent journalist and a previous winner of the Orwell Prize. Turner writes, in June 2016, Lucy Letby was just ending her holiday in Ibiza when colleagues at the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit texted with exciting news. A rare set of identical triplets had been born, and although 7 weeks premature, the baby boys were thriving. At this point, 70 pages into this meticulously and unexpectedly gripping book, the readers will be filled with cold dread. For God's sake, you think, don't let her near the triplets. But what the jury never heard from an expert witness is that the triplets were not healthy. Not at all. They were born from the same placenta. In fancy talk, they were monochorionic. Monochorionic triplets are at a much higher risk of collapsing and dying, statistically 5 times more likely to die than single births. John Coffey's and Judith Maritz's book, Unmasking Lucy Letby, is 426 pages long. It does not mention the word monochorionic. Nor does Janice Turner's review. Nor does Lady Justice Thirlwall's condemnation of those of us who doubt the convictions as noise. I'm no scientist, but in simple layman's English, these were sick kids and they had a big chance of dying. So pointing the finger at the nurse who was looking after them is, in my opinion, rather uncomfortably, like witch hunting. Heaven forfend, but judges sometimes get it wrong. So do journalists. So do the police.
I'm Detective Sergeant Lucy Kennedy. I'm part of Operation Hummingbird. When I joined the investigation and started looking through every bit of evidence that we've got, I think it then becomes apparent of just the severity of the investigation. We aren't medical experts, we're not even medically minded, so it was hard for us to fathom how to put this medical bundle together.
We're not for a second suggesting that anyone in Cheshire Police behaved dishonestly, but is it possible that everyone, from Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes down, did not properly understand the complicated medical evidence they were dealing with? Did Operation Hummingbird get it, for example, that monochorionic triplets born from the same placenta are 5 times more likely to die than from single births? Did they understand the assumption that these triplets would be healthy was a bit rubbish?
Steve Watts is a retired detective with 48 years policing experience, finishing his career as an assistant chief constable. And more to the point, he was, before he retired, the lead detective in England and Wales, advising how police should investigate deaths in hospitals.
Let's talk a bit about Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes. He's the lead, he's a senior investigating officer in the Operation Hummingbird. You've seen the Cheshire Police PR video.
Yeah.
And in it, he says words to the effect of Lucy Letby is present at everything. Everything he means suspicious events, deaths and collapses.
Yes.
Do you think in that video he shows somebody who has got an open mind?
I think that he and the rest of the investigation team thought they were doing the right thing. I think they were working really, really hard to identify whether or not these babies had been killed or unlawfully injured, and to identify the person that had done it. I think they were working really hard to support the families and give them answers and give them closure. And I think they were working really, really hard to support the medical staff, the Countess of Chester. So the investigation was very well structured, was very well resourced from what I can see. But I think the problem is that at a very early stage, they accepted the evidence of one expert that the babies had been unlawfully killed or harmed, and they accepted the proposition that Lucy Letby was the person who'd done that.
The name of that one expert is Dr. Dowie Evans, the prosecution's star witness. The evidence of Dr. Evans was critical for the case against Lucy Letby, as Detective Superintendent Hughes explains in the Cheshire Police PR video.
We eventually received signed statements from Dr. Evans, who was our primary lead witness, and Dr. Evans had defined in his statements that he thought the children had been harmed by infliction, and a variety of different methods for that. And then at the same time, the analytical product had been coming together and the investigative products had been coming together.
Dr. Evans determined which baby deaths and which baby collapses were suspicious and which were not. Here's Detective Sergeant Lucy Kennedy again.
Some of these medical records are 1,000 pages long because some of the babies had been in the unit for weeks or months. We then took it to him for him to review, and he would decide whether there was a suspicious case or a non-suspicious case.
You will be hearing more of Dr. Evans in our next episode, Star Witness. Remember, former top copper Steve Watts is not saying that Cheshire Police or their star witness behaved dishonestly, but, like judges and journalists, They're human beings, and humans can sometimes make mistakes. Former Assistant Chief Constable Steve Watts continues.
And I think from that point on, there was confirmation bias, and the investigation moved from being an investigation of how these babies had died and become injured and who might be responsible to gathering evidence towards confirming the hypothesis that Lucy Letby had been the offender. And I think that's, again, because of unconscious confirmation bias, which can affect all of us, and which in an investigation, you've got to be really, really careful to recognise the potential of and to avoid. But I think that's what's happened in this case.
What about all the complicated medical evidence the jury heard pointing to Lucy Letby's guilt?
In policing, you need to progress the investigation on the basis of hypothesis testing. And the way that you test a hypothesis, and the hypothesis in this case was, well, there were two. These babies were killed and harmed unlawfully, and secondly, that Lucy Letby had done it. The way that you test those hypotheses is to attack them in a scientific way, is to say, okay, let's demonstrate the null hypothesis here. Let's look at disproving what is the other evidence, what are the other options, what are the other things that potentially could have happened, who are the other people who could have done this, what are the other explanations, what are the other scenarios. And what I think has happened in this case is that at a very early stage, a decision has been made that the babies have been unlawfully killed and injured, and that this particular individual, Lucy Letby, was responsible. And the evidence that has been gathered in order to confirm that hypothesis without testing other hypotheses, for example, insanitary conditions.
But as an old copper, what you're really looking for is a smoking gun or an axe in the hand of the killer.
You're always looking for best evidence, and okay, in this situation, they were never going to find that. But the fact they haven't found that doesn't justify making what I think are unjustified extrapolations in relation to all of this other circumstantial stuff. Because when you look at something in isolation and say, that doesn't make somebody a murderer, when you add it to something else that doesn't make somebody a murderer, and you add it to 5 other things that doesn't make somebody a murderer, that doesn't make somebody a murderer.
You've been a copper your whole life, and this case, and it's not your practice to be some kind of professional gob on a stick, but you think that this is bad because Lucy Letby isn't a monster and the law has got it wrong.
I think the law has got it wrong. I don't know whether Lucy Letby killed these babies or injured them. I don't know that. And I don't think any of us will ever know that. What I do think is that the evidence does not support, the evidence I've seen, that I've heard, does not support the conviction of Lucy Letby.
We put our concerns to Dr. Dowie Evans that he had not properly reflected on what Professor Jane Hutton described as alternative explanations. Dr. Evans pushed back on this, as we will discover in our next episode.
At Lucy Letby's trials, Dr. Dowie Evans was the star prosecution witness. But did the jury hear from Professor Jane Hutton? She wanted to tell the whole story about the sick kids far more likely to die than you would expect, about the killer bacteria, about a badly run neonatal unit. She wanted statistically to paint the whole picture. Well, long before the trial, long before she could deliver her picture by numbers in the round and set out the lazy assumptions that pointed unfairly, perhaps, at a serial killer, she got the chop.
The Guardian got the scoop. The paper's David Conn and Felicity Lawrence reporting that they'd seen emails telling the story. In April 2018, an officer on the Operation Hummingbird investigation approached Professor Jane Hutton. Without naming Letby, he asked Hutton whether she could put a figure on how likely it was to just be a coincidence for one member of staff to be on duty, and I quote, during all the deaths and collapses in the neonatal unit, i.e. 1 in a million, etc.
The professor told the cops, The Guardian reported, that a proper statistical inquiry would from the get-go not concentrate on one member of staff, but instead required full research into all possible explanations for any increase in babies collapsing, including their medical conditions and whether they were premature, as well as the performance of the unit. The cops, the paper suggested, signed a consultancy agreement with Professor Hutton and agreed fees.
The force did not proceed to commission Hutton's analysis, but contacted her again in 2021 after Letby had been charged, The Guardian reported. In an email, the officer told Professor Hutton, the paper claimed, "We have had a further meeting this afternoon where we have informed the prosecutors that we were looking at the validity of the statistical evidence again in this case. The prosecutor does not agree with our line of inquiry and has instructed us not to pursue this avenue any further at present."
So Professor Jane Hutton got fired. But we believe the defence never heard about this.
You had somebody, an expert, who was potentially going to give another view in relation to those statistics, and you deliberately decided not to use that person. There have been enormous issues over the past few years around failures in disclosing material by the police and by the Crown Prosecution Service. And a number of pretty significant high-profile cases have been lost because it's come out at a later stage that the appropriate material wasn't disclosed.
Is it an offence not to disclose this kind of information to the defence?
No, it's not an offence per se, but if it was done deliberately, then certainly it would be misconduct in terms of if that was a deliberate act by police officers. And if it was a deliberate act by the Crown Prosecution Service, then there would be disciplinary issues as far as they were concerned. If it was done deliberately, and there's no one which I'm suggesting this was the case at all, if it was done deliberately, then it may give rise to consideration of a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Because if you do anything with the intent to detrimentally affect any matter that is going through the justice system, including a trial, if you knowingly do or do not do something to affect that, then you could potentially be perverting the course of justice. If you do that in concert with other people, then you conspire to pervert the course of justice. I'm not suggesting one moment that anybody has, but you've asked me the question as to what the offences might be. The short answer is no offences as far as the CPIA Act is concerned, but there might be disciplinary issues. And at the end of the spectrum, if you could demonstrate that people got together and said, we're not going to disclose this because if we do, it would have this effect, that could potentially be an offence of perverting the course of justice.
On this question alone of the hiring of the Professor of Statistics and not telling the defence, do you think that Lucy Letby had a fair trial?
On this alone, she definitely did not have a fair trial. This was an important piece of information. It was important enough for the investigation team to go down the road of considering appointing an expert to look at the statistics and give a view as to validity. We believe that expert would have given a contrary view, and that's the important thing for the jury to hear. And if they were not able to hear that, then that means she's not had a fair trial, in my view.
What about the prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service telling the police to drop Professor Hutton?
The constitutional relationship between the police and the Crown Prosecution Service is that they do different things. The police investigate, the police gather evidence, and they present that evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service. The role of the Crown Prosecution Service is to review that evidence and to decide, based upon the prosecutor's code of practice, whether or not there's sufficient evidence to charge, whether it's in the public interest to charge, and then to conduct the prosecution, either themselves, their own solicitors, or with barristers. In my experience, there has never been an occasion when I or any of the officers I've worked with or have worked under my command, to my knowledge, have been instructed by the Crown Prosecution Service to do or not do anything. I've had many, sometimes heated debates with Crown prosecutors and with barristers over the pros and cons of charging or not charging on particular cases, the pros and cons of following particular lines of inquiry. But I've never been given a direct instruction. If I was given a direct instruction by Crown Prosecutor's Service, I would have flatly refused, and I would have reported them to the Director of Public Prosecutions or the Chief Crown Prosecutor. It is not the constitutional position of the Crown Prosecution Service to instruct the police to do or not do anything.
We put that point to Cheshire Police and the CPS. The CPS have yet to respond to our request for comment, but Cheshire Police said, as a result of 2 trials, Lucy Letby was sentenced to 15 whole life orders in prison. The appeal court has rejected both of Lucy Letby's appeals. There are currently 2 active investigations that are continuing. In addition to this, there is an independent statutory public inquiry with oral evidence ongoing. In light of the ongoing investigations and current active legal proceedings, we will not be commenting any further on this case.
This is not some minor legal technicality. This is about following the rules that prevent a jury from hearing bad evidence. And please remember, bad evidence kills Sally Clark. Look out for our next episode on the Crown's star witness against Lucy Letby, Dr. Dowie Evans. It's called Star Witness. We're crowdfunding this podcast to pay for its production costs. If you're able to support, the link to the crowdfunder is on our social media feed. This is a Chalk and Blade production co-produced by Jason Phipps and Ruth Barnes. Ross Ramsey Golding is the editor. Legal services were provided by Sarah Vandor Mackay at Reviewed and Cleared.
With thanks to Cheshire Police for their archived footage in this episode.